Hello, welcome to the WPP Media Intelligence Podcast. I'm Kate Scott Dawkins. I'm joined by Jeff Foster and Nidhi Shah. We're catching up after, it feels like some people are on holiday, but we're still getting a lot of requests in from clients and teams. So definitely not holiday week for us yet.
Yeah, not quite yet, but we're getting there.
Yes, yeah. And warm, I think where both of you are, right? In London and New York?
Yeah, we've just had a really bad heat wave. It's finally cooled off here, but I think it was breaking records the last few days.
It's pretty much the same story in London as well. It's been so hot. But that's all we talk about, apparently, the weather.
It's true. I read a book when I was preparing to move to England for my graduate degree called Watching the English. And it was great. I mean, it gave insight into speaking as an American, but now also an American who has lived in the UK for a number of years. But the insight into, ironic garden gnomes and chit chat and all the rest of it, I thought was great, super helpful as someone looking to, move and acclimate into a new culture. And then there were still things that surprised me. Things like the phrase tickety boo, which
Oh, yeah.
for a nation, proclaimed to have such a stiff upper lip, I think the phrase tickety boo just really that still tickles me. Well, all was tickety boo in Cannes last week. We haven't caught up. We did put out a special podcast episode with Spotify's Brian Berner last week. Check that out if you haven't yet. But we haven't really done the sort of the recap on our side. So there are a few announcements we'll cover in brief, and then also just maybe some personal perceptions of the week. It was great to see so many clients. I mean, that's where I spend my time when I'm there. Lots of conversations about AI, which was great. All the thinking and writing and work that we did as a part of this year, next year was really appreciated in terms of clients looking at this and trying to figure out what they should be focused on or what they should be leaning into. So that was a big piece for sure, both in terms of the opportunities. I think when I was talking to partners in the TV space and the out-of-home space about how much more important, impactful, human-focused advertising was going to be in a world where we were likely to get more bot-to-bot advertising. And then also some of the watch-outs, right? Actually, there was just news this week about an academic study that looked at people using AI and how it led to, it looked like decreases in terms of brain activity while you're using it, and then also for creativity, which Cannes is a festival all about creativity, but I think too much use of AI tends to lead to that homogenization of content because it's built on averages and large amounts of data. So something for all of us in the sort of thought leadership space to look out for.
Yeah, definitely. I think, at least over here in the States, monitoring all the news from Cannes, it looks like AI was definitely top of mind. So looking forward to hearing more about that and what your POV was from over there.
Yeah. I think clients just want to understand what's coming, what to do. Should they be writing a bunch of new content or videos or making greater use of platforms like Reddit, for instance, where these models seem to be getting their information to inform recommendations and overviews? That was a big theme, I think, across a number of different client categories, whether it was B2B, energy, CPG, all of the above, really. But there are also some announcements. We can do, I think, a quick run. It's always announcements during Cannes Week, but some of the ones you highlighted, Jeff, might be good to chat through.
Yeah, I definitely noticed a theme with lots of ad tech announcements, especially more on the connected TV sides. Saw that there was a Disney and Amazon announcement, an Amazon and Roku announcement, and then a Netflix and Yahoo announcement. So I'm not sure if that was talked about on the ground there, but it was definitely making a lot of noise over here in New York and in LA.
Yeah, I think there have been conversations this week too. I was at the TVOT conference in San Francisco yesterday, and it's a good time to remind people this show is not meant to be investment advice, but there were murmurings about whether the Amazon Roku deal potentially meant there was an acquisition afoot in that area. I'm not sure about that, but I think there's a lot of focus around partnerships and alignments that are coming out of all these things.
Yeah, I guess one of my questions was, or thoughts was, after reading all these announcements, it seems like every major media company of some sort is developing more of advanced targeting capabilities, which makes sense because that's where the market's heading. So I guess, how are companies, do you think, how are they going to differentiate themselves, or is it sort of commoditized? We all have, if we all have advanced marketing, advanced targeting capabilities, and we all have X, Y, and Z data sets, and we can hit these audiences, then I guess, how do you differentiate yourself if you're losing a little bit more of the legacy old school ad sales of human to human interaction and selling demographics?
That's a great question. In the content space, my gut reaction is to say buy your content. And I think that still very much works. We've talked about things like sports rights, who owns the rights to this or that, who has the, buzzy show that everyone wants to watch. I think those still matter 100%. And then maybe there's still elements of data and interoperability that are important. I know when we're talking to our commerce team, for instance, and there are so many different commerce and retail media networks available, right? And some of the things that they look at when they're assessing are, reporting, data, access to data, how much are they willing to collaborate and do things for a client that are different, unique, or go deeper into their data sets and audiences. So there may still be some opportunities for individualization in that way, but I have to think in that world of content-driven advertising, as we're calling it, that bucket, that the quality of the content and the amount companies are willing to spend on that content to get quality is still really important.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought too, because it's interesting, reading through all the press releases, there's definitely a similarity amongst a lot of them. I mean, obviously there's nuances in them. For example, the Amazon and Roku partnership mentioned a pool of like 80 million connected TV households, which is a huge number. And then obviously looking at a little bit at the Netflix and Yahoo space, I think they mentioned that would be targeted in the 12 countries where ad sales are taking place for the ad tier for Netflix already. So there's definitely different nuances, but it's very interesting because everybody sort of seems to be moving into a similar offerings, or at least that's what the market's looking for.
Yeah, and it's smart in terms of the addressable TAM that these media companies, especially TV, haven't addressed yet, right? Which is that 75% of advertising revenue that sits outside of the top brands, which is why I thought there was another announcement out of the UK this week, Nidhi, around ease of buying, moving to more digital-like buying and making it easier for advertisers beyond, say, the top set to use television and streaming TV.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense. We've talked a lot about legacy media owners looking to diversify and, really compete for ad revenue. And, especially as you see kind of some of this content-driven forms of advertising, such as linear TV decline, right? It's a good development, making it, as you say, more accessible to smaller advertisers, especially who are used to buying in those digital environments. But I am still a bit conscious, and it's still unclear how much of incremental ad revenue will be generated. And I know in the US, Kay and Jeff, you guys have seen, platforms already offer self-service options. So, have you noticed any shifts to kind of TV growth as a result?
Not as such yet. It's pretty early. Versant's pretty early. So some of this is getting started. I think what is interesting, another one of the themes we heard out of Cannes was really looking for incrementality, looking to capitalize on the benefits and effectiveness of TV. That was a big part of some of the Palais conversations. And so you could see a world where some of this advertising revenue actually gets moved from a platform like Meta, which has enjoyed a lot of growth over the last decade plus, back into a form like TV. And I think when you look at some of the news headlines in just the last couple of weeks from Meta in particular, having alternatives, probably something that a lot of advertisers would be very interested in. We had this one I didn't think got that much traction in the press, actually. There was news that Meta was using local host support sort of allowing them to track and link web browsing data to user identities and bypass some of the protections on Android phones. So Ars Technica covered this, but not a lot of other major media outlets. The Wall Street Journal, I would call that one a major media outlet. They covered the prevalence of scam ads currently on Meta, and the quote was around, so this is a quote from the Wall Street Journal piece. An internal analysis from 2022 described in company documents likewise found that 70% of newly active advertisers on the platform are promoting scams, illicit goods, or, quote, low quality products. So I think these few things together, along with, continued news around social media bans, the ban in Australia in terms of limiting social media use below a certain age or going ahead. They did a test that seemed to work. So all of this together may be starting to turn the tide a little bit in terms of people looking for alternative, effective channels and places to put money, especially if they can still get some of the benefits of targeting and self-service platforms and all the rest of it from TV and potentially away from Meta as an example. Right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, all the factors are there for TV to capture some of the share again. It makes a lot of sense. I think, especially the biggest barrier for small, medium-sized businesses is the content creation and the creative side as well, and spending money on that. But now with the AI tools, I think, I really think this is going to be an area where you can see a lot of growth in the next few years.
Yeah. No, some of that's probably a ways away, right? And there's still multiple ways to get in and fragmentation. So for the small, medium-sized businesses, maybe it takes a little bit longer. But I think for large brands where those allocations can be made at a high level relatively simply, they already have TV buying. Maybe we start to see some of those shifts earlier rather than later.
Yeah, excellent. Absolutely. And I know in our analysis, we saw that, the larger brands definitely behave a lot different than the smaller brands, and the top 350 advertisers, they, continue to rely on TV as one of their primary channels, versus where the smaller and medium-sized businesses, it's about 80% is digital spend.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how those trends hold in the coming years.
Yeah. I will say the counterpoint to that is that people are still interested in influencers.
Yeah.
The places where a lot of those influencers exist are on places like Instagram. Yeah. So there's definitely a push and pull. Influencers were, on display all over Cannes. I think I heard lots of people on the Quasat talking about how much more it felt like there were influencers around and promoting themselves this year rather than previous years. We had a lot of press pickup coverage on our stat in the report around how UGC, content-driven advertising was going to overtake professionally produced content-driven advertising revenue. I do think there's still this element of wanting to find communities, wanting to find culture via those influencers. And these couple of things around wanting to support the creators and the influencers themselves, and also looking at the platforms on which they exist. Those things are kind of at a tension point for me right now. All right. Well, it was a good week. I'm glad to be back. And let's keep going with some economic news, mostly out of the US. I mean, it remains a very tension-filled everything is in tension right now. Stocks are up right today, at least when we're recording this Friday morning. We have seen, the news around the US-China trade deal, according to news reports, is signed, although we don't have a lot of detail on that yet. And yet there's still, I think, concern around consumer sentiment, around the sort of disconnect between hard data and soft data we're getting out of the US. Do we do a vibe check again? What are you guys sensing in terms of how people are reacting in market or news you've seen talking about this?
No, I think that sums it up perfectly. It's very odd. It feels like there is a little bit of a disconnect of the way people feel, and then when you see the hard data, that's definitely has been throughout the year, and it seems like I think there's just even a lot more uncertainty coming into the second half of the year. But on purely anecdotal level, it just seems like people feels like they're pulling back on spending or being a lot more conscious on spending, especially in the major cities here in the U.S. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that flows through in the second half data. But everything so far has been pretty solid, leading up into this point.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty much similar in the UK as well, to be honest. We haven't really seen inflation peak as what we've seen, previous year and a half ago, right? People are conscious. They are being cautious of what they're buying. But, things like restaurants, still busy. So, yeah, I'm still ordering my takeouts. So not really affected me on a personal level, if I may say so.
Yeah, anything to avoid cooking is what I say. Not my favorite. All right.
Yeah,
Well, let's get into some media news, given it is the Media Intelligence podcast. A bunch happening in the US and amongst the global advertisers and ad sellers as well. Jeff, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, so I know right before Cannes went into gear, we had the Warner Brothers Discovery split up news. So that should probably be completed about within a year or so, is what analysts seem to think. But the core of it is that after all the rumors that Warner Brothers Discovery will be split up into two separate companies, one comprising all the cable television networks, and then one comprising the studio and the streaming part of the business. So of course that leads to a lot of what ifs if it's not that frequent when a major Hollywood legacy studio with a rich IP catalog comes available or potentially might be available. We have the whole DC catalog, of course, Harry Potter, tons of TV shows. So it'll be interesting to see what the strategy is on that. And then, of course, with the cable networks, is that going to combine into one of the other companies with the NBCU spinoff? There's, of course, all the uncertainty about the Paramount cable channels. So there's a lot of what ifs in the cable side of the business as well right now. But I think once all these deals make it through the regulatory process, I just think we're going to be poised for some consolidation. That's just my gut and looking at the numbers. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so obviously Zaslav is keeping his post at the head of the studio TV business, streaming business. Everything I've sort of read and heard, I don't know him personally, but that, he enjoys that aspect of being a part of film lore and this sort of Hollywood glamour piece of things. So I'm interested to see where that could head in terms of an acquisition if he was on the being acquired side of that, how much appetite there is for that. But certainly the other piece of business, I think, is being set out as a potential target and probably not acquirer given this level of debt that's still going to be involved. But
yeah. No, I agree. I mean, the last, MGM sold to Amazon, and that was the last, that was a smaller scale studio than Warner Brothers. So I think, from a content perspective, it's an interesting play if that scenario does work out. If you're an Apple, Netflix, a YouTube, you have to be a little bit interested, right? Are you making a phone call over to Zaslav to test the waters?
And there was a lot of assumption as we came into this administration that it was going to be a free-for-all for M&A. Then, though, the level of sort of intervention in every single category, including media and entertainment. If you look at the Paramount deal and how much that's been sort of cast into uncertainty due to investigations by the administration, that there's going to be pause for anyone in this space looking to do a deal and how much government scrutiny is going to come alongside that, not necessarily from an antitrust point of view, but more from a what do you even call that kind of scrutiny? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just straight up political scrutiny.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I just know if I was over at Netflix, I feel like I would have to do my due diligence and at least make a call over there. Same if I was at Apple, I think you'd have to kick the tires on that one a little bit just to
pretty big
gauge.
Pill to swallow for them, though.
It is
easier given Apple's cash hoard. So
exactly. So, but it would be an interesting content play. And then on the cable side, again, did you aggregate, you combine with if the other Paramount cable channels become available, the cable still generates a lot of cash right now. I mean, they are putting more debt on Warner Brothers Discovery on that side of the business. So that may impact things, but then they're also giving them a sizable stake in the streaming and studio business. So if that gets sold, then the cable business could have a nice pile of cash
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fun things to think about on how this could all play out. But I think it's going to be a lot of changes, but we'll see.
Yeah. And then the picture in Europe, I think, is given how reluctant governments have been there to accept big mergers, right? TF1 and M6 was disallowed or struck down. And actually, the CMA is still investigating Omnicom IPG, actually on that same sort of theme. I think it's now been given the go-ahead in the US, I believe, from the last reporting I saw. But there we're looking at more sort of strategic deals, right? So, Nidhi, you want to talk about Netflix and TF1?
Yeah, and I think before I entered this year, and I just thought that more M&A and kind of these strategic partnerships would be happening more at a regional level. Last week's news on TF1 partnering with Netflix, providing, kind of all their channels, their streaming content on Netflix, with Netflix being that aggregator, was super interesting, but surprising for me at first. And it was when I looked into the press release, right, and saw in France. So really, both kind of benefiting in the sense that Netflix can benefit from kind of the local content, whereas TF1 can, recapture maybe some of those TV audiences it may have lost from kind of the shift to streaming giants such as Netflix. So both benefiting. Financial details are not disclosed, so we don't know what this really, in essence, is framing like. But I think it's interesting to see kind of broadcasters in general in Europe really expanding beyond their kind of home market. So TF1, for example, looking into its own streaming services, not using an international platform like Netflix, for example, to expand into new markets such as Africa. It's already expanded into markets such as Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. A lot of these are French-speaking countries. So really, I think, there is something there in terms of not just focusing when it comes to all the kind of self-serve platforms just in home markets, but that kind of broadening reach amongst others as well.
Yeah, and you could see the value of a tie-up. I mean, they've been talking about a tie-up with across the UK platforms for a while, right? Like, what if it was a service that offered Channel 4 plus ITV plus BBC? What if it also included Mediaset and TF1, right? But it's hard, I think, for those players to all agree. The things we've seen that have been tie-ups like that, Hulu, right? Mm-hmm. And the US is now back fully owned by Disney. Didn't last forever. Balancing the desire to compete with big globally scaled US-based players versus, getting agreement across that many different companies, which are also, in some cases, competing in the same markets, is tricky for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, as I said, it's quite surprising, where you draw the line, right? Like, at what point does your direct competitor become your partner versus, how much you're going to rely on your own kind of streaming platforms to carry forward. So fine line and interesting to watch.
Yeah, I was on a panel yesterday with broadcasters and legacy TV players-ish, streaming TV players, and asking whether they were looking at that as a symbol that as we go through these cycles of disaggregation and reaggregation or unbundling and rebundling, whether they were looking at that as Netflix and the other streaming giants becoming the new aggregators. But I think it was not top of mind, or they certainly didn't want to necessarily engage on what that might look like yet. So yeah. Still more to come. I'm sure we'll be discussing it again here throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah, because legacy media has definitely had an interesting relationship between selling content to Netflix, the Netflixes, and then trying to compete with Netflix. So yeah, I think more to come on that.
Yeah, and some of it still coming down to sports, right? Yeah. So there's more sports news in the U.S.
Yeah, so a couple big stories. So we've been talking about it here a lot, so ESPN acquired a minority stake in the Premier Lacrosse League, the PLL. So, it's just to show us how strong the market of sports is. We're sort of these, secondary leagues, no offense to any lacrosse fans, but maybe leagues that aren't quite as popular in the US are now getting a lot of attention as just the demand for sports content and programming is just continues to rise. So this new agreement will start next year. ESPN will be the exclusive home for professional lacrosse. And it's also timed quite well because lacrosse is going to be a demonstration sport at the 2028 Summer Olympics in LA. So this could, catapult this sport into a little bit more of the public awareness. And I thought it was very interesting to see that, fans will be able to stream all the games on ESPN Plus and the new flagship service, of course. And then they're also going to be targeting select games to be on major networks like ESPN, ABC, ESPN, and ESPN2. So definitely a lot of exposure for lacrosse. So these,
And the
I think
Olympics
we're going
has
to
been
see
a
more of
great
these. Yeah.
launch pad for other sports and popularity in the past, especially when it's hosted in the US and people are really exposed to this. Still waiting for the US archery deal. It's a big deal in Korea. We import everything else from Korea. Why?
I think it'll happen.
Archery leagues, maybe one day.
Yeah. And then there was, this may have made the news out there when you were in Cannes, but the other interesting thing on the sports side too is that the Lakers were sold at was it $10 billion valuation. So I just thought it was an interesting, just to kind of put it into context. Paramount, when it's being sold, is a $8 billion valuation. So the Lakers, one single team in the NBA, has a higher valuation than Paramount. So I think that is just an interesting data point to show where we are in the world with sports content. So it was
fascinating.
A fun mental experiment. I mean, obviously the Lakers are probably one of the crown jewels in sports, but if you start thinking about, roughly 30 teams in a league or 32 teams for major professional sports in the US, obviously they're not all going to have the same valuation, but you start thinking about, the valuations of the leagues versus what the media companies are, or just the teams.
Yeah.
It really, it'd be I know Forbes puts out their franchise valuations, but it'd be fun now to kind of compare that to market caps of media companies. And it's, I have a feeling
value per hour of content produced in a year. That's what we need to look at.
Exactly. So I have a feeling some, the NBA might have a valuation closer to Netflix, or in the NFL for sure, than some of the other legacy media companies. So it's just fascinating to see the growth in sports continue it seems to be like unstoppable.
Yeah. Well, Sport Beach was a big draw in Cannes too. So I think we've been saying this for more than a year, right? There is something about sports that is still communal, that is still either us engaging in something together, playing something together, or watching it all together, supporting the same team with the same emotions, watching the highs and lows at the same time. Like, that is still I believe, fundamental human necessity, right? And again, linked to similar kinds of feelings, I think, from people who are church-going potentially, but this feeling of collective effervescence, of being in the same moment with other people, is important. I think is even more important when we spend the rest of our time in our little boxes staring at a screen, 6 inches from our face. So to me, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think, again, in support of things like social media bans for kids under a certain age and school phone bans, I think it's super important to make sure that we as humans are getting enough of that collective experience and social interaction and all the rest of that. All right. Anything else we haven't touched on yet that we need to?
I think that's it's a lot going on, but I think that's it for now as we head into the 4th of July holiday, not too far off.
Yes, I think we're going to take a break from the pod next week. I'll be on vacation, finally. I feel like I can't quite convey to our listeners the extent to which putting together this year, next year report really takes up every waking moment of thought and energy. And so now I'm looking forward to stepping away from my screen for a little bit.
It's very well deserved.
Yes, we will be back later in the summer. I'm sure we'll have, nothing will slow down or stop. So we'll have new things to talk about for sure. We'll have to get caught up. But in the meantime, I hope it gets cooler for both of you, and we'll speak to everyone again soon. As a reminder, the WPP Media Intelligence podcast is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only, and the views are not meant to be taken as financial advice.